out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to You Have to Say That's Magnificent, or Benvenido, I should say, on this occasion to this World Cup theme pod from Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. Having already discussed the World Cup stories of the other two hosts, Canada and the USA, we're now donning our finest sombreros, supping our Corona or Dos Equis, or maybe even grabbing a tequila and a taco, and we're venturing south of the border into the fascinating world of football Mexicano to discuss the story of El Tri, the Mexican national team at the World Cup. And who better to guide me on this journey than our very own Professor of Latin American Studies, Dr. Pete Watson. Benvenido, Pedro el Profesor.
Hola, Aidan. I feel I should shout andale, andale, arriba, arriba, to kind of get the speed of Gonzalez, the kind of obligatory reference in the pods. But how you doing, mate? Good to see you.
I'm very good. The guys will be very proud that you've got that one in early. Now, that's actually brought something, before we even start, that's brought a little anecdote back to mind for me. I remember as a young lad, impressionable, naive, all of that, pre-86 World Cup. So I'd never seen Mexico play. Some kid at school shouting, "Andere, andere, arriba, arriba," decided to tell everybody that they were actually Mexican players. And this was somebody talking about players for the Mexican national team. And I believed this all the way up to probably this 86 World Cup. So there we go. Perfect introduction.
Any of the various Gonzalez's that have represented Mexico down the years were ever nicknamed Speedy. I'm sure it's the kind of thing that Dave Coleman fitted in one of his commentaries somewhere as a winger, kind of beat another guy, and the chance came up.
And if he hadn't, he certainly should have done. Right, okay then, let's get cracking, because we've got, many World Cups to get through. Canada, we only had 2. The USA, we had quite a lot. Mexico ups that another level, I think. Proper football country now, I think we're into. So before we delve too much into their World Cup history, as I say that, it's fair to say football in Mexico, certainly historically anyway, is far more of a cultural and social institution in Mexico than it is at either of their 2026 co-hosts. So in this basic sense, Mexico seems a little more akin to the South American nations, I guess, than to North America. So when it comes to the national team then, Pete, how deep a significance or an attachment perhaps do the Mexican people have for their team? And is that maybe any different in the modern age where the best players are far from home, and so the national team is the only time they really get to see that?
Yeah, no, it's a good one. I think it probably now is seen a lot closer to the South American nations, but it might not have actually gone that way just because of its proximity to the US, obviously bordering nations. And there was a lot of baseball in Mexico. There was obviously a lot of US influence, particularly in the border states. So it wasn't particularly guaranteed that football was going to take off. And it does take quite a long time. The first baseball leagues are actually, I suppose, slightly more official than the football leagues in the kind of early years. The first baseball leagues found in 1925, which is before, the Mexican football leagues. But, there are a lot of similarities in how it kicks off. We've got the kind of British, expats are working in different companies in Mexico, in different parts of Mexico with railways and with different industries and mining. And it grows in power. In lots of ways, actually, one of the different things between South America is that actually the Spanish have a lot of influence on Mexican football. There's actually a time where the Mexican League have got quite a few teams made up of a lot of expat Spaniards. There's teams like Asturias and España who owe a lot of allegiance to Spain. So it's slightly different from Latin America in that way. But in terms of importance, it's certainly really important now. I think that they've gone beyond, an era of always being disappointed, and maybe being disappointed in how the national team does and not feeling they can compete, to really feeling that it is a way in which Mexican sport can prove itself at a national level. And there's always this kind of probably a sense of frustration that they haven't really done that to the extent that they really want to. I mean, 2012 in the Olympic Games is still, the men's best success. You could argue that the best success in Mexico in World Cups actually might even be the Mexican women's team in the 1971 Copa, which became famous for the documentary the England's women's team is part of. But it's certainly something that is really important. It becomes very important whenever they play the USA. It is seen as something that they should be able to dominate their gringo neighbors, with all the kind of historical conflicts and border issues and Latino criticism that comes its way from Republicans and Trump and so on and so forth. So football definitely matters. The issue you talked about the players playing abroad is very much a more recent phenomenon. For a long time, it's very rare to see Mexican players playing in Europe, or obviously the US, just because the US league wasn't up to much. But as Hugo Sanchez and a few others blazed the trail, and it wasn't anywhere near as much as Argentina or Brazil, but more and more Mexican players have left the league. And although that in some way maybe reduces the pull of Mexican league to some extent, I still feel that they're one of the few leagues in Latin America that does retain a lot of their best players in their league. That certainly isn't the case anywhere else.
Okay, great. And it's right to flag that it was a bit slow on the take-up, because that's a major contrast to the USA and Canada. That's something we've delved into on the other episodes of this, is that USA and Canada were outside of the UK. Basically, it was the first international outside the UK. And in terms of uptake of the game, sure, a lot of British expats and all of that, but it was introduced far earlier than in most countries, and even ahead of internationals of Argentina, Uruguay, which is the other big uptake in the Latin America part of the world. But okay, let's get into their World Cup story then. So yes, they were later into FIFA than either Canada or the USA, but they did join in 1927, which was just in time to take part in the Olympics the following year. It didn't go so well. They lost to their former colonial overlords, the Spanish. The team, as you say, have massively influenced Mexican football. It was 7-1. Oh dear. But 2 years later, they travelled to Uruguay then as one of two teams from North and Central America, along with the USA. Grouped with France, Chile, and Argentina. They did have the dubious honour of being the first team to concede a World Cup goal, losing the opening match 4-1 to France. They did have a rather tough time of things, though, in Uruguay in 1930, didn't they?
Yeah, it didn't go well. I mean, it didn't start well either. It took them something like 28 days to actually get to Montevideo from Mexico anyway. Part of the problem...
How? Compared to many countries, it's surely much more direct and easy.
Yeah,
no?
I mean, look at their route, though. I mean, I think that they got a few things wrong. So they started, they got from Mexico City to Veracruz, which is the port in Mexico, and then went to Cuba. That's not too bad. But then probably going to New York is probably the wrong way. They did have to buy balls there, so that's maybe why they went up that way. Couldn't get enough balls to travel with, so it didn't start well. Apparently, also they didn't train much on the way down, mostly because they were afraid of losing the valuable balls they bought in New York over the side. So it wasn't great. I think you're right. They're one of the first teams to concede a goal, and it doesn't go well. They lose. All three games, 1-4 against France. And even that because they'd actually managed to injure the French goalkeeper early on, so they couldn't even beat, I can't remember if it was a winger who went in goal for France instead. Lose to Chile 3-0 as well, and then, 3-6 against Argentina, which I think Argentina went fairly gentle on them. There were reports in the Argentinian press of Mexico being enthusiastic but little better than primitive. So,
Ouch.
Yeah, slightly harsh, arguably, from a nation that, by now was already a very established nation. But I think the other thing is that this tournament did give everyone a chance to be the first at something. So, so that's the kind of idea. We have the first penalty taken and scored, apparently, was by Manuel Rosas. So he's got that in his armoury. He, unfortunately, also scored the first own goal against Chile. So he had what we call a mixed tournament. But he was also only 18 years old and 93 days. So he for a long time was the youngest goal scorer at a World Cup until Pelé beat his record in 1958. So there are a few things that at least went their way. Another thing that went their way as well was that after the Argentina game, the keeper, Bonfilio, actually saves a penalty of a guy called Fernando Paternoster, who was one of the better defenders in that tournament, Argentinian defender. And the story goes that Carlos Gardel, who was an absolute kind of legend tango singer, one of the most famous musicians in the continent, was so impressed by him saving this penalty that he went to congratulate him after the game, and the goalkeeper asked him to sing a song as a present. So Gardel sang El Dia Que Me Quieras, the day that you love me. So, Bonfiglio at least has that memory as well. But not many other things went well for them. There are a couple of good figures. Juan Carreño is a bit of a standout figure, known as the trompito, the top, because he had quite a bulky top half of his body and a slightly thinner bottom one. He was the guy that scored their first goal. Again, another first. In Mexico, he was famous for having a prostitute girlfriend whose name translates as Mary Lemon, and also was well known for wearing a beret. So, a natty dresser, natty off the pitch, enjoyed the dancing, enjoyed the nightlife. He came from a very poor background, and apparently another story goes that he once was in a game where he betted against the Necaxa team. Apparently then Necaxa, he was losing, didn't have any money to pay them off, set off on a run, played a 1-2 with one of the Rosas brothers. And then when Rosas crossed it, Carreño apparently pulled the shorts down of the guy marking him and then scored to save the bet. So clearly a kind of exciting figure. And I think the 1930 World Cup is full of players like that. So it's always nice to remember these kind of colourful figures of the past.
Oh, absolutely. You don't get this kind of anecdote on Jonathan Wilson's podcast, I tell you. This is gold, footballing gold. Anyway, not so good for Mexico, as you say, and it will be quite some time before it did become good. But we'll get to that. They didn't make either of the other pre-war World Cups. However, for 1934, they did beat Cuba no fewer than 3 times in second round qualifying. I don't know why that was necessary, but they did also get to travel to Italy for a playoff just days ahead of the World Cup opening against the USA. Ostensibly, I think because the USA had entered too late to be as part of the normal qualifying. So for some reason, they just shipped them both over, let the USA in, who promptly then beat Mexico 4-2 in Rome Stadio Nazionale. So Mexico made the trip, played in the World Cup stadium, but did not take part in the World Cup. An awful lot of effort to travel only to be eliminated before it even began. It's quite incredible.
Yeah. The good thing there is it only took them 15 days to get there. So they'd clearly got better at travelling in 15 days. They
didn't have to go and pick up any balls in New York, hopefully.
I mean, they went via, again, Cuba again, then Vigo, Southampton, Cherbourg, and then got the train to Rome. So again, lost fitness, apparently. That's the thing that they're blaming that for. That game sees a Mexican sent off, actually. That's the first time a Mexican is sent off in, I guess you can kind of call it a World Cup preliminary. Antonio Azpiri is the guy to blame, and did it in front of Mussolini. Apparently, Mussolini was at the USA Mexico game, even though it wasn't technically part of the World Cup yet. The bloke that actually scored all 4 of the USA goals was actually an American football player who coached the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cleveland Rams. So couldn't even get beaten by a guy, who played a different sport. So wasn't
not
ideal.
A proper footballer, no.
Yeah, I think apparently as well, 3 of the players decided not to come back and stayed in Italy instead. So, I mean, not all was lost for those 3 Mexicans anyway for the trip.
I wonder how that worked out for them, given what was about to happen in Italy and the world. But there we go. They did also have one of the joint top scorers in qualifying with 7 goals, probably thanks to playing Cuba so damn often. Dionisio Mejia, 7 goals. There you go. So that's something. Okay, disappointing, but still that was better than 1938, where they withdrew from qualifying in the January of 38 in protest at Argentina's late inclusion in Central American qualifying, only for Argentina to then also withdraw a couple of months later, leaving Cuba as the representative from that region at the World Cup in France. Yeah, another odd one.
Yeah, I think this one, the interesting thing about this one is that it's kind of a lot about South America also flexing its muscles with FIFA. At this early stage, there was a kind of idea that the World Cups were going to be swapped between every 4 years between South America and Europe. So with Italy holding the previous World Cup in 34, Argentina very much expected to host it in 38. So when it was given to France, Argentina, did what a lot of Latin Americans do very effectively and launched a hissy fit. Sorry, Argentinian friends. But it is important to see that South American nations did not want to be taken lightly and saw this as being a diplomatic affront. And pretty much all of the other nations that were thinking about applying to this World Cup also withdrew. As you say, Cuba do buck that trend, as do Brazil. But it's one of those first times where we really see a kind of a political bloc, or at least a geographical bloc, angry with the way that FIFA is running football and the way in which tournaments are being organised. So I think that particular decision is actually quite noteworthy, seeing kind of continental alliances based on, probably a kind of or a kind of a resentment about being seen as colonies or being seen as lesser. So that it's important for that, at least.
Argentina with a hissy fit. At least they've got out of that habit, haven't they? Oh no.
Yeah.
No,
you'd never accuse any Argentinian player of having one. So.
Okay, well, after the war, fortunes were slightly reversed in the 1950s and 60s. And Mexico, they became regular qualifiers now, as I guess befits the strongest football nation of the region. Qualified in 1950 for the second time, but again lost all three matches in the finals, this time thumped by Brazil and Yugoslavia, and then narrowly to Switzerland. They repeated this trick in 54. Again, impressive qualifying, only to lose all of their matches yet again. Brazil again, 5-0 this time instead of 4-0 in 1950. So it's getting worse. They did fight back from 2-0 down against France to 2-2, then conceded a late penalty, which Raymond Copper scored. So there, I guess, signs of improvement there. But are we, at this point, seeing a massive difference, I guess, here between regional dominance and being nowhere in the global terms still at this point?
Yeah, I think this is the real problem that they have. It's Mexico is quite isolated by this point. What is happening is that some of the South American teams are touring Mexico, but it's obviously a brief interlude. So certainly a couple of Chilean clubs, a couple of Argentinian clubs are going across. There's been some kind of Spanish teams as well, but Mexico has been slightly isolated. So the type of teams they're having to qualify against aren't challenging them a great deal. We're obviously not in the era where players are really going regularly to Europe. There's been a brief spell of the Oriundi, the Rimpatriati going to Italy, and a couple of players going to Spain, but that's from South America rather than Mexico. So the 50s really represent a time in which Mexico, although football is much more important, it's kind of established. The league is slightly more established. The era of professionalism is beginning. A slightly more national league is also developing in Mexico itself, but the quality of football hasn't really come along. They're also quite unfortunate to always meet Brazil, or seem to always meet Brazil, who are very much one of the dominant forces in world football. And I suppose in lots of ways, there is also a kind of an awareness of this in Mexico. You see that there is, I suppose, are little expectations. They don't really expect to deal with Yugoslavia or Switzerland in the 1950 World Cup. And, the results in 1954 aren't particularly surprising. They actually see the France 2-3 game where they're beaten 3 minutes to the end. And that being quite a disputed handball. Raymond Coppa is the guy that scores it, but a lot of Mexicans say it wasn't a penalty. So that is the first sign of, I think, progress. That's the first time I think actually we could potentially compete. Losing 5-0 to Brazil is an absolute hammering. If you look at what is remembered of 1950 and 1954 in particular, you're kind of looking at certain figures. This is where Antonio Carvajal, La Tota Carvajal, who is the goalkeeper, he's I think the first footballer who plays in 5 World Cups. So he does become a figure of national pride. There's another nice little story in that Thomas Balcázar, who scores one of the goals against France, is actually the grandfather of Chicharito Hernandez, who also scores his first World Cup goal against France, also at the same age of 22. So that's a nice little story. Other kind of little anecdotes from those kind of World Cups is that the goal that Mexico score against Yugoslavia, it actually comes from a penalty as well. And this is on this. You can actually see the video of this if people are interested. is that one of the Mexican goalkeeper, there's a cross in the Yugoslavian goalkeeper punches it away, and then one of the Mexican attackers actually knees him in the stomach. The Yugoslav goalkeeper kind of pauses, turns, and then punches another Mexican, not the one who actually did it. The referee actually manages to see this, awards a penalty, and then Ortiz scores it. There's also a nice little moment, though. They kind of redeem themselves after that great moment of cheating. In the Switzerland game, both teams have the same colours. They're both wanting to wear red shirts, and they toss a coin to decide who should change kit. Mexico actually win the toss, but then allow Switzerland to wear their home kit instead, and then go and borrow the blue and white shirts of Gremio of Porto Alegre, where the game was being played. So that's a few of the kind of stories. But actually, a few of the Mexican players in that World Cup, in the 50 World Cup, are banned afterwards due to unprofessionalism, drinking, and not taking things seriously. Velasquez and Gomez are two of the players who this befalls, and there are videos also of them at a meal, strumming guitars, singing songs. So they didn't quit themselves particularly professionally, either on or off the pitch. But not a good period, the 50s, or the first two World Cups of the 50s anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, indeed. So let's get to 1958 and a slight uptick in fortune. Another strong qualification. They thumped both the USA and Canada on the way and then head off to Sweden. Once there, in between big defeats, so yes, it wasn't exactly a major improvement. Big defeats to both the host Sweden, who were, of course, on their way to the World Cup final itself, a very strong team, and to Hungary. Mexico took on Wales in Solna, and this was a historic occasion for Mexico. A dramatic late equaliser and a 1-1 draw, and somebody becomes a hero for life, I think.
Yeah, this is it. The Héroe de Solna, the hero of Solna.
I'm glad you pronounced it. I wouldn't have done it quite.
It's one of those that they could have maybe come up with something a little bit better. But this is a guy called Jaime Belmonte. The man from Belmonte. We could almost make a terrible pun about. Sorry to everyone. He is one of the first Mexicans footballers to have a statue made of him. He played most of his career at a team called Deportivo Irapuato, in which he scored 125 goals in 350 odd games. But this is the goal that he is known for. This is the goal that he scores from a header, and he is not a big man. He's actually known as El Flaco, the thin guy. So the fact that this goal comes from a cross and a header from that is quite surprising, actually. That's not what they really thought about, particularly as the other memories that Mexicans have of that game is that they were, they really battled against a physically bigger Welsh team who actually, in the eyes of Mexico, played quite a violent form of football. So that's kind of part of the narrative of, battling Mexicans, smaller Mexicans against a European nation. So you've got all those kind of narratives fitting in, the David versus Goliath. And that goal with 3 minutes before the end of the game is celebrated still. In actual fact, the first game of the next World Cup will be the 68th anniversary of that goal. So I wouldn't be surprised if Jaime Belmonte's name is being remembered in that particular moment.
Well, I've got a nice little quote from him that he talked about. This is going earlier this century, so a long time after the fact. He said, "It was a huge sort of satisfaction for the team and me personally as well. That goal has brought me countless wonderful moments and recognition from many people throughout my life." And if he gets to be at Mexico's opening game, that'll just be another one to add to that list.
Yeah, I mean, I think he must have died by now. I haven't looked it up, but I think.
Well, maybe they'll just bring his ashes. Yeah, let's just say that. He'll get talked about then.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm trying to think if this is the World Cup that there's one guy left. I'm trying to remember if that's true. I can't remember. There is in one of these 50 World Cups. I think what might be one guy still alive, but it's such a big moment. I think even though it's Wales, and again Wales see that particular World Cup as being one of their major historic moments, first for them in many ways as well. So it's not the biggest team to have scored a point against in many ways, but it's the geographical location and it's the myths that are created around it, and the fact there are people like John Charles who was a legend of the international game at that time. So he is a big figure, and I think this is where you also see some of the other players of that generation who are also remembered fondly and still remain amongst the kind of the greatest canon of Mexican footballers. People like Raul Cárdenas, who is the centre-back of that team, he won 11 trophies in his career, and actually was the manager of the 1970 World Cup as well. So he has a kind of storied history. And Salvador Reyes, who is one of the goal scorers, one of kind of Guadalajara Chivas' great goal scorers in Mexico as well. He actually played at the age of 71 in the Mexican First Division. He came on for Chivas. Yeah, so he had retired, but Chivas were about to retire his number 8 shirt, I think, and decided that the best way to do this was to actually play him in a league game against the Pumas, against UNAM. So he starts the game, plays a minute, and then is substituted off to rapturous applause. And I think he may be the oldest player to have ever played in a top division professionally, because it wasn't a friendly. So that might be wrong. I think it's certainly true in Mexico anyway, but if anyone knows...
Well, surely, I mean, it can't be. I mean, there's stories of like Kazu Miura from Japan playing into his 50s, I think, but, that's not this.
Yeah, but
Wow.
I mean, Reyes, that's Reyes. I mean, he will play in 58, he'll play in 62, and he plays in England as well. He also scored the goal that qualified Mexico for the 62 World Cup. He's remembered for that. That was a game against Paraguay. So I mean, there's those kind of players that do establish a reputation, who are starting to become legends of the game. And that particular game against Wales is certainly a key part about why not only Belmonte, but other players in that squad are also fondly remembered.
Well, absolutely. And yes, it was the first point they'd ever scored in a World Cup, having lost all 8 matches in their previous 3 appearances and one playoff in nearly a World Cup. They obviously lost their first game in this one as well. So to date, it says here on the internet anyway, whether it's true or not, I don't know. No other team has ever lost 9 consecutive games in the World Cup. So that's some achievement to add to their list of accolades as well.
Yeah, one they're hugely proud of.
Anyway, 1962, they go on better. Hurrah! Things are getting better for Mexico. The first victory at the World Cup. Okay, they lost their first 2 games yet again. This is Brazil and Spain. A great solo goal from Pelé in the first one, prior to his injury, obviously. And then they were within a minute of a draw against Spain. Now, that would have been a hugely significant result. I'm quite sure this is the Spain of Helenio Herrera and Puskas in the team.
Yep.
But they did lose. But then they beat finalists in waiting, Czechoslovakia. So on the face of it, an incredible result, but the Czech were, of course, already through and on the way to bigger things. This game, though, was notable for the fastest ever World Cup goal, 15 seconds from Václav Mazek, which Brian Robson did not beat in 1982, despite some English press claims. Hakan Şükür beat it in 2002. But this was Mexico's first ever World Cup victory. The Czechs did not need to win. So I guess that helped somewhat. But Mexican progress and being far more competitive is clearly the pattern here, which they showed again in England 1966, I guess, as well. Draws with France and Uruguay, either side of the loss to England. But clear progression at this point, which is probably just as well with what's coming around the corner next.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's consolidation. There is increasing confidence in the game. The fact that they don't get absolutely battered by Brazil, which was already a tradition, is a mark of that. This is actually a World Cup that people can look at. There are some of the games, and actual full games can be watched online. If you suddenly feel that Mexico, Czechoslovakia, following our discussion, is the game you really need to spend your Tuesday evening watching. One of the things that is worth watching in the Brazil game is that Garrincha is playing, and Garrincha is having fun. He is completely toying with the Mexican left back. Pelé scores a great goal as well. It's worth noting, one of the funny things, I did watch the highlights of the Czechoslovakia-Mexican game because, I'm that dedicated a researcher. And, apart from the goal after 15 seconds, the Mexican commentator actually says that Mexican players were still as cold as a penguin in the Antarctic, and that he hadn't even warmed his throat up by the time that Masek scores that goal. The other great thing about it is that there is a foul by one of the Mexicans against a Czech forward, and you can audibly hear someone in the crowd shouting "Comunista," communist. So the kind of level of crowd banter and political kind of insults is obviously is obviously right there. So there were a couple of highlights from that one. The 66 World Cup, again, is progress. Uruguay, obviously a slightly declining force by this time. France, they've done well against before, so getting that draw after that narrow 3-2 loss, a couple of decades before was vindication. Fans of English football might like to know that the goal that Bobby Charlton scored, the very famous Bobby Charlton goal from that 66 World Cup, is against Mexico. It's the long-range one that kind of flies into the top corner, and the goalkeeper stands there lies on the ground looking like he's just been shot.
With England desperate to score at that point, of course, after
absolutely.
their draw with Uruguay, the pressure was on, and there's Charlton and Mexico.
But it is progress. And again, a couple of the players we've already talked about are still there. There is also a guy called Enrique Borja, who again becomes one of Mexico's leading ever goal scorers internationally. In fact, he was the leading scorer until Carlos Hermosillo took over. He scored 31 goals. So there are a few players that are starting to show their worth. And apparently Jose del Muro, a defender whose name means Joseph off the wall appropriately, apparently was approached by a few English clubs after the 66 World Cup, although much like most other Mexican players, he turned any approach down and stayed in his country. But Mexico are now believing they can compete. And as you say, this is important because obviously they've got the World Cup in 1970 to really host and try and progress it.
Well, absolutely. And big attention, big focus on Mexico in 1970. Often held up as one of the greatest World Cups. We talk off the field, I guess, first of all, or the overall, before we get into specifics of Mexico's performance. It's the first time the World Cup has been outside of Europe and South America, which adds a huge significance, I think, and quite the coup for Mexico, I suppose. And selected ahead of Argentina on this occasion. Argentina would get the tournament 8 years later, of course. But equally, it was pushing things ahead in many ways. We had the dazzling color images. We had satellite broadcasting it and beaming it around the world, the Telstar, which the ball was named after, of course. But what did hosting then mean for Mexico? And just what a way of bringing focus and attention on a country that was probably, I don't know, maybe a more of an afterthought at this time in global terms?
Yeah, I mean, this is the key idea, that this international perception of Mexico. I think Mexico as a country had struggled to shake off the images that the Mexican Revolution had created and also American cinema had created. The Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1920, a very violent war, internal civil war, but also one that is the first one that's filmed. And a lot of images of the sombrero, the gun-toting bandit, the kind of dirty criminal, the kind of violent Latino, comes from that era because American TV cameras are shooting it. And because America is also the kind of Mexico is the other, if you like, of the USA. So whenever we have these Westerns, the Mexican figure becomes the enemy, the dirty scoundrel, the cheating bandit, the no good cur, if you like, the bandido. So and again, this is a kind of general idea that ties into colonial identities of Latin America as a whole being back. And Mexico, in lots of ways, hasn't really emerged from this for quite a long time. It takes quite a long time for Mexico to modernize after the destruction of the revolution anyway. But the 60s and 70s is a period where Mexico has, developed quite substantially and also sees sport as a way of projecting a much more modern image to a global world. And television is a key part of this. It's worth remembering that this is not the first major event that Mexico's hosted. It's the second one. The 1968 Olympics have taken place.
True.
So that's a big deal. And again, they continue this same idea with hosting, the 1971 Women's World Cup, which again is not official. It's not officialized, but it did take place. That's not the first one. There'd been one in Italy just the year before that. So there is a policy going on, and the attempt to show, stadiums like the Azteca as being these kind of palaces of football, these giant stadiums with over 100,000 people taking place, are designed to show a nation that is proud, upcoming, developing, financially secure. It's also interesting that these are tournaments that largely the government is not really responsible for or doesn't have as much of a role in, because this is all to do with the television companies and the football authorities are really behind this. The government is on side, obviously, but this is part of maybe even the way in which that kind of whole period of the close partnership between TV, private enterprise and FIFA takes place. It's also important in lots of other ways because Mexico is having to. There's also been a massacre. In 1968, there's the Tlatelolco massacre of students in Mexico City, which tarnished the start of the 1968 Olympics in lots of ways. So they're still trying to get over that too. And I think that this particular World Cup, with the colours you've talked about, with the great Brazil team, with the sheer amount of crowds, with the excitement it generates on a global level, not only makes the World Cup memorable itself, but also projects Mexico in a much better way than it had really ever historically been projected in the kind of media in general. So even though a lot of the imaginaries will still remain, at least some of those, it is at least contributed to be remembered as maybe the first televised Great World Cup. We could possibly go that far, I guess. I don't know what you think about that, Aidan.
Well, absolutely. I mean, historically, people still talk now of this as the best World Cup in many ways. Now, obviously, when it comes to that kind of thing, history clouds some of it. You lose sight of the bad moments, the boring moments. If you revisit the 1982 World Cup or 86, which we'll come on to, of course, the people of our generation look fondly back on. There was also a fair bit of dross in amongst the highlights. There always is. But it takes a bit of time to forget all of those and remember the good bits. But I think because this was so bright and colourful, crucially because it had that Brazil team, obviously that massively affects the view of the tournament because it finished with such a flourish. The way a World Cup finishes is has such a big bearing on how it's perceived. I think historically, you could have a poor World Cup final and everything that had gone before. It's not forgotten, but it's diminished slightly in some ways. You need a little bit of a good denouement to really leave people thinking fondly of it. And Mexico 1970 obviously had that. But I think the way the images even now are still so vivid, so bright, I think the colorization is probably partly to do with the technology at the time that just made it look extra bright, but obviously it was played in dazzling sunshine as well. The biggest of the games in Azteca, a futuristic stadium, of course, which we will see again this time around. I think it definitely there was flourishing moments too. You had the many Pele moments, the moments that he didn't score, almost as well, probably more famous than the ones he did. The shot from halfway, the Gordon Banks save, the running around the Uruguayan goalkeeper, all of these things that we see again and again and again. Not to mention other highlights, Italy, West Germany being, well, there's a plaque commemorating that at the Azteca, I think, isn't there, as match of the century? Although really it was the extra time of the century, I suppose. There's the, what else? There's the England-West Germany game, of course, and some terrific group games too. So I think, yeah, it's perceived so magnificently because of Brazil mostly, but not entirely. And I think the way it was hosted, packaged, if you like, and broadcast to the world was a major, major advancement, a huge step forward. You look at the images of England 1966, and yeah, you can get coloured versions of some of the games, but it looks from a different era. Brazil 1970, the kits, especially Brazil's, look more modern. I know they're not, they're still heavy cotton, but they look slightly more modern. Whereas in 1966, everybody's, short back and sides and very neat kit. In 1970, it's getting a little more loose and it just looks a little more modern. So I think it was a watershed moment. And yeah, for Mexico, hugely, hugely significant. And on the field too, not too bad at all. So they're wearing green now by this point. I don't know what point that changed, Pete. I mean, you said earlier they were wearing red, and they obviously did in all the early World Cups.
Yeah, here and there, yeah.
So they look more familiar now. They played all their group games at the Azteca in Mexico City. Obviously, you got the bit of the advantage of altitude, of course, and they're far more familiar with it than others. There's the odd situation too where I don't quite know why. I think it's just to do with overall seeding of ability rather than anything else. Both CONCACAF teams were drawn into the same opening group, so Mexico did get to face El Salvador. Mexico drew goalless game with the USSR, a very, very strong team at this point. 4-0 against El Salvador, and then 1-0 victory against Belgium. So suddenly we've gone from a case where a win was a historic occasion, a historic moment only 8 years earlier at this point, that now we're winning 2 games, drawing the other, and progressing through in fine style. So this is the first time they won 2 matches, first progression beyond the group stage to a quarter-final. Rather unfortunate, I guess, though, because they were level on all measures with the USSR. So lots were drawn for who would win the group and who would come second. This is an intriguing little sliding doors moment here, though. If they'd been the ones drawn out, so spoiler, yes, the USSR won this draw. They won the group. Mexico was second. USSR then end up in the Azteca as group winners and played Uruguay in their quarterfinal in front of, they had lost to Uruguay, were a strong team, in front of only 20,000 people in the massive Azteca, which is a weird sight. It must have been weird to play in. Whereas Mexico had to go to Toluca, much smaller stadium, play Italy. They were in front of only 26,000 instead of what would have been, 115,000 in Mexico City. So it's odd how that goes. That game, didn't go well. They got beaten despite having taken the lead through Jose Luis Gonzalez, lost heavily in the end. But it's interesting to think, what is on the face of it, it's a hugely successful tournament. There's no way around that, no matter how it ended. But if they'd been drawn out, what would happen?
That's the thing. I mean, and it makes such a difference. I mean, we are talking the fact that there is, the game against Belgium, which they win 1-0 with the goal by Pena. And by the way, the tackle by the Belgian is a knee-high challenge that the guy does well to walk away from. But there are 108,192 people, apparently. That's the figure that I found, the Ranci Azteca. That is a lot of noise. If you've got 108,000 Mexicans chanting you on, it's hard not to do well. But it is, for a long time their most successful World Cup. The result against USSR is great. They expect to beat El Salvador, or actually, if you watch the game, I think it's David Coleman again is calling them Salvador the whole game. I think he just doesn't realise that L is needed. There's so many long shots in those games. I don't know. I watched the highlights. There are kind of these 8-minute little clips of them, and there are so many people taking shots from about 30 odd yards. But it's a really big deal. The Italy game is unfortunate, but obviously they get to the final, get beaten by Brazil. So you've got the argument said, well, we lost to the second best team in the World Cup. So lots of fond memories. Everything really comes up effectively for the local organisers. And again, like I say, the whole TV industry is so central to Mexican football. There is such a proximity between, the stadiums, the major clubs, the power structures within Mexican football and the TV. And this is the one where it really consolidates it to the extent that, it becomes a crucial feature in why 1986 eventually gets given to Mexico after Colombia pull out. And it's probably quite a crucial reason why they've got games in this coming World Cup as well. So I think that's something that, for example, people in my field of academia have focused on a great deal about this World Cup and actually the importance of that TV, private enterprise, FIFA network, and some of the figures that are crucial within it as well.
Yeah, the private enterprise and other things going on. So it was slightly more marketable as a tournament as well. There's lots of advertising hoardings around the stadium, especially in the Azteca, for the big games. And that's something you just didn't have prior to this point. And no, we're still a long way. Well, we're only, 4 years away from Havelange now at this stage, who did push that kind of things far more. And we're an awful long way from the glitz of USA 94 when it went into overdrive, I guess, and as the Blatter regime came in. But it's the first signs of it. It's very much the first modern World Cup, if we can still say that about something that was 56 years ago now. But yeah, it's definitely, we've moved eras, haven't we? I think that's clear. It's interesting you mentioned the shots from distance at this tournament. That's something that 86 had a lot of as well. And clearly, I think people are thinking, well, thin air, the ball's going to move faster, maybe a little unpredictable as it travels through the air. Exactly. Why not? In terms of legacy for Mexico, obviously they end up hosting again in slightly different circumstances in the 80s. But on the sporting side, it didn't quite work out as legacy. It's very much on theme for what we've had with Canada and the USA, where a World Cup success is followed by disaster and disappointment. You'd think, though, in the case of Mexico, they'd have been slightly better set up to build on this success. But no, They failed to qualify in 1974, which was their first failure since pre-World War II. They did make it to Argentina 78, but were poor. They had the dubious honour of being the first team to lose to an African team at the World Cup, losing 3-1 to Tunisia that time around. They were absolutely thrashed and outclassed by West Germany, 6-0, and also a very strong Poland team. The only real good thing about Mexico in that tournament was the stunning kit they had. I mentioned before they changed to green. It looks better, but they had a very nice kit in 1978 and had some huge, noticeable haircuts, but not a lot else. And they also failed to qualify for 1982. So if we sort of sandwich in between, before we even get on to the 86 and all of that, to go from 1970 through the next 3 tournaments of 2 failures to qualify and 1 disaster, it's very slim pickings to be sandwiched by hosting it twice and being quite successful twice.
Yeah, it's a weird one. If you look at the 2 non-qualifications, there is potentially the way that CONCACAF run their qualifying at this time that is maybe to blame. So in 1970, what they do is that because a lot of the nations within the CONCACAF region are not particularly rich, what they decide to do is have a qualifying tournament played in one country. So the 1974 the one for that is played in Haiti. Mysteriously, Haiti topped the group. Wonder why that was. Haiti, in his example of potential home team advantage, they beat Trinidad and Tobago 2-1, but the referee of that game ruled out 4 Trinidad and Tobago goals. And the 2 match officials, Jose Roberto Enriquez and James Igué, are both banned for life by FIFA. What also happened, this is also during the dictatorship of Jean-Claude Duvalier, who is known as Baby Doc, who has a very distasteful reputation. So I think that might have paid some impact as well. This is also the land of sorcery, voodoo. Apparently, the Mexicans blame black magic because apparently one night a bottle exploded in their room and shards of glass struck some of the players, including the keeper. And not only that, but apparently a box appeared in their hotel corridor that contained a slaughtered black chicken. Of course, it might not have been a great idea to have a massive party at the Société du Rhum Barbancourt, one of the big rum distilleries in I think Port-au-Prince, where the players were quite inspired by this rum to drink rather too much. But they failed to qualify in that period. And the same thing kind of happens in 82 when the World Cup qualifies for CONCACAF being hosted in Honduras. Once again, Honduras are the team that top the group. Mexico come third. So, maybe there is some issues there with what's going on with who's hosting it, but it's very poor. It's just worth, with 1978, the team is awful. They're seen as being really the worst Mexican team ever to play in the World Cup. And this includes quite a young Hugo Sanchez as part of this team, and also Victor Rangel, who was another kind of great Mexican striking hope. But anyone who enjoys a beard and afro combo, and one of the great haircuts of all time in football, please do look up Leonardo Cuellar. That's Cuellar. He was known as the Lion of the Metro, and you can see why. He has a magnificent fro. Probably their best player in that World Cup, actually. So if nothing else, one of the great haircuts of all time, probably up there with Valderrama in terms of the greatest fro to grace a football field. I think that's probably the only thing we can really say of any praise about that 1978 effort whatsoever.
If you're going to be bad at the football, at least stand out one way or another. And the combination of his afro and that kit, I think, is glorious. So whether he was any good or not is almost irrelevant. But yes, I think he was their key player at the time, and probably the only one performed with much distinction.
They have a good way of doing the national anthem as well. They're all in line and they've all got their hands horizontally against their chest. So they're excellent coordination for the national anthem. Lacks coordination in defence. As you say, they're ripped apart by Germany. Rummenigge is basically running riot. Yeah, I mean, it's chaos. And again, that team, are not thought of well. Cuellar actually tells a story that after the World Cup, they were all given policemen to guard their houses because Mexican fans were so angry. So it was a failure from start to finish.
But that brings us neatly on to 1986. And yes, having hosted only 16 years before, Mexico were given the honour again, but not in the standard way. This was, as you mentioned before, a World Cup that was meant to be in Colombia, which I'm sure you'd have enjoyed looking back on if that had been the case, Pete. But sadly, no, it's Mexico. Colombia withdrew due to financial concerns, I think, really. This is an expanded tournament from the one Colombia had originally been awarded. I think that's probably part of that as well. Mexico then won out ahead of the USA and Canada, nicely on theme with these pods, to step in and host what seems to be something of a predetermined fait accompli in terms of how that bidding played out. They had their issues, they had their troubles, but there was an earthquake not long before the tournament. That was in September 1985, so with 8 months to go. So we're even getting into consideration of, does it have to move again? And maybe the USA would have had to step in at that point. God knows how that would have all worked out. But this is Mexico becoming the first country to host the World Cup more than once. So again, we talk of how significant 1970 was for Mexico off the back of the Olympic Games 2 years before. Now here we have them as the first nation of all the footballing nations in the world, the first one to host it twice, is quite the achievement. But then being given this tournament when Colombia had to pull out, like I say, the USA's massively detailed bid document was cast aside, their lengthy speeches, while the Mexicans were just busy drinking in another room, knowing they were going to win. Was it a case of maybe 1970 nostalgia that helped them over the line, or are we just talking grubby deals, or is it a need to go to somewhere with a major football culture to try and be a more of a sure thing?
It's several of those things, but I think we're looking at politics. You know, the relationship between Televisa, the Mexican TV channel, the fact that Guillermo Cañedo has a key role in FIFA by this point, the fact that he is a close associate of João Havelange, the head of FIFA. The fact that the infrastructure is also there probably plays a part. But I think we're looking at politics and networks and connections. I think to a lot of extent also, you know, the idea of kind of continental pacts and, you know, against kind of colonizing nations or even kind of the global north also has, you know, some kind of role. But I think, you know, to all extents and purposes, we are looking at the power of diplomatic networks and knowing how to manage that and money, you know, doing its bit. And again, that's something that Havelange does very effectively. There's a very good book by a guy called Luis Burlamaqui, Brazilian academic, who talks about how accomplished João Havelange is at not only, you know, at creating the networks within Brazil, but then internationally to then, you know, challenge Europe, to challenge the global north, who have really dominated football organization in lots of ways. And this is kind of part of this. The networks that exist with private companies, with the Mexican TV channels, but also within FIFA as well, are there. And that's what really, I think, defeats the USA to a large extent.
Well, they would get their moment a few years later. Possibly, we could say 86 would have been a bit too soon for them in footballing terms. So, yeah, maybe just as well, Mexico got the nod. So this was Mexico probably feeling the pressure to do well off the back of 3 tournaments of failure and disappointment. They had some better players by this point. So Hugo Sanchez is, of course, around and performing well in Real Madrid, I think, at this point. Chief among their squad. But I think they had more depth than ever before as well. There's many names that will echo through the years for those of us from our generation: Javier Aguirre, Manuel Negrete, and people like that. They were coached by Bora Milutinovic, who would feature again in this series. He's a bit of a journeyman coach, but always successfully bringing second-tier nations, shall we say, to performing or overperforming and doing well in World Cups. So this was the first of those successes, I guess, for him. They were in Group B, where they defeated Belgium 2-1. A really good result. This is Belgium, who would ultimately reach the semi-finals, of course. Didn't start so well, but you know they were still a good team. Drew 1-1 with Paraguay, having gone ahead early. Then defeated Iraq 1-0 to top their group and advance to the next round, staying in the Azteca crucially this time around. And there they met Bulgaria, in the first knockout round. And now the success, this is the round of 16, of course, but a knockout victory here, 2-0 against Bulgaria. Negrete's goal here. This would have been goal of the tournament in many a World Cup, I think. It was absolutely phenomenal. Superb goal in front of 115,000 people at the Azteca. Barry Davies on commentary, I think, did it really nicely when it was Negrete, Aguirre, Negrete, something like that. I think if I do him justice there. It was very, very good. Very good. What a goal. Look that one up. Everybody must look that one up and try and recreate it if you can in midair in your back garden.
I mean, I did that. I'm sure you did. This
yes.
is World Cup. And I vividly remember, having someone lob the ball at me and try to do that scissor kick time after time, and like having a very bruised hip, landing, in the kind of parched grass of July, whenever it was. So yeah, that's one of those goals that it was that and Josimar. They were the goals that we all tried to emulate in that particular World Cup.
Absolutely. And Mexico, if we're talking sartorial elegance and kits, they did wear white in that particular game. It was green mostly, but they were slightly forerunner of having, well, not the players' names on the back of their shirt, but Mexico written on the back of the shirt, which was a nice little touch, I think, as they were all playing there and standing there with their arms across their chests for attention in the anthem. In incredible atmospheres, I think it's safe to say, in the Azteca. In the quarterfinals, though, just as they did in 1970. So again, they've hit that benchmark in a home World Cup. So maybe that's portents for what might come this year. But again, they had to change venues to Monterrey this time, and they lost to West Germany. Now then, this has got to be a massive frustration. So it was a goalless draw. This is West Germany, who would, of course, reach the final and indeed come within a few minutes of taking Argentina to extra time in that final, fighting back rather well. So they had a lot about them. They had a lot of nous. They had a lot of tournament savvy, of course. But they weren't vintage West Germany. Goalless draw and then the penalties. I mean, dearie me. The pressure, I suppose, the expectation, the burden on everybody's shoulders was simply too much. It was awful. You can put this, I guess, akin to Barcelona's failure to deal with pressure in penalty shootout against Steaua Bucharest around this time as well. In this case, Mexico, with the semi-final beckoning, with all that momentum and hope against a team that was there for the taking, and they just couldn't cope.
So, yeah, and I think what made it even more frustrating is that Thomas Berthold had been sent off for Germany, so they did have a one-man advantage for quite a big period of time. And there's a few chances which probably they should have scored. I mean, there's a great save by Schumacher at some point. Sanchez might have had a penalty. There was a few great chances that Mexico really should have scored. And then Javier Aguirre gets himself sent off. And unfortunately, Aguirre, although a well-respected player, there are two kind of moments where he really blots his World Cup copybook. That's one of them. And the second one is his tactics. I think it's in 2002 when Mexico lose to the USA in the last 16, which again is inexcusable. You can't do that. So Aguirre has a slightly checkered history for Mexico at these times. It's one of those games where you feel that they've kind of shot their load a bit too early. They've tried so hard. The whole fans are kind of backing them, and they get to these penalties and they feel like they crumble. The only one that I think scores is Negrete, maintains his kind of hero status for, neutrals in Britain, inverted commas, and Mexicans themselves. But the penalty that Quirarte takes, Servin's penalty is awful. And, and they don't get to maybe some of their better ones. So that particular generation, and again, this is my first sticker album, and I remember the likes of, obviously, Sanchez, but Miguel España was someone that inexplicably I quite liked. And then they had Thomas Boy, who, again, was one of Mexico's great kind of attacking midfielders. He's actually the captain of that team ahead of Sanchez. So it's one of those incredibly frustrating moments. And I think in lots of ways, though, what makes the tournament continue to work, even though Mexico go out at that stage, is that everyone then joins the Argentina bandwagon. Maradona, obviously, in the same level, they've beaten England. We obviously don't need to go into that. But the fans still keep coming out to support Argentina, to enjoy the tournament, to do the Mexican waves that become very famous. So So at least that momentum for the tournament continues, even if Mexico as a team don't. But we'll always have Negrete. That goal will always go down as Mexicans, in lots of ways, greatest goal in the World Cup in many ways. Probably still is. Jared Borghetti will score a header in a couple of tournaments time we'll talk about. But yeah, that goal, it's magnificent.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Certainly in a visual way, as well as the significance of getting through a knockout round to quarterfinal. In terms of, before we depart 86, the Hugo Sanchez, you've talked about how many Mexicans until much more recently were home-based, and that's obviously massively the case in this time, but not Sanchez. So I think he hadn't played for them, or we had in the running, I think, but there'd been a fair stint where he hadn't been playing, or basically because he was in Madrid and it clashed with club fixtures, I suppose, rather than any sort of stance or anything like that. But how was he viewed then at this time for Mexico? Was he a bit of an outsider within the squad, or was he the returning hero that all hope was pinned on?
It's probably the second. I don't think anyone. It's difficult to know, and I haven't really looked at the press narratives about that. But I think the in lots of ways the disappointment for Sanchez is that he never really does it in a World Cup as much as he does it for the teams in Spain that he represents. He's famously the Pichichi wins it 5 times. I can't remember, it's 5 times in a row or something like that. But for one reason or another, he never performs in a World Cup. 1978, he's a bit young. He has one amazing scissor kick in that one that doesn't go in. But 82 obviously doesn't qualify. Not really his fault that he can't play for Mexico much until this. But, he doesn't have the greatest of 1986 World Cups. And actually, what's interesting, I did look up what the best ever, Mexican World Cup teams were seen to be my Mexicans. And most of them don't have Hugo Sanchez in it. And it's probably for that reason that he just doesn't do it enough. Is he their best forward player ever? Probably yes. But not for the national team enough when it really matters. He isn't. I don't think he was ever either the Mexican leading goal scorer in internationals either. We've already talked about it being Borja before, and then it becomes Hermosillo, and then it passes on eventually to obviously players who are now playing a lot more games, a lot more often.
So as we move on after 1986, could Mexico build on that success similar to 1970, hosting and getting to a quarterfinal? Well, no, they could not. Now, it wasn't just a failure to qualify this time around. They were banned, in fact, from the next World Cup in 1990. They did reach the CONCACAF Championship finals for the 1990 qualifiers. Local tournament which doubled as the qualifiers, but they were disqualified, though, having been found to field an overage player, or perhaps a handful of overage players, in an under-20 tournament. Now, this does seem a little bit harsh to me. Is it excessively harsh? I don't know. There's a lot of hot topics about cheating in sport and football at the moment. So I do, the cynic in me, and I forever am cynical about everything relating to sport, organizations, FIFA, and in fact, most things in life. I do wonder if, in part, the harshness of the punishment was to help pave the way to the USA to qualify for 1990, because they had to qualify ahead of their 94 hosting. That's just my cynical viewpoint. What do you think, Pete? Am I being crazy, or is this just a harsh punishment or a fair one? What do you think?
Well, I think we both know that FIFA are one of the most transparent, clean organisations that never engage in any favouritism to ensure that the right political companies and businesses would have the things they need. And as a fan of a team quite involved with this, I think that all punishments for any form of slight illicit cheating behaviour are vastly, vastly unfair. Tongue heavily in cheek with that one. It's one of those interesting issues because in lots of ways there's been quite a lot of talk about how close major figures within the Mexican football organisations, how close they were to FIFA chiefs, particularly Joao Havelange at this time. I think we mentioned with 1986 about how it was that Mexico could achieve that through, the kind of networks they had with the TV companies, with, the owners of the stadiums. So this feels almost like a swift reversal. The scandal itself, it happens in an under-20 World Cup, as you've said. There are at least 4 players that were too old. One, the captain, Aurelio Rivera, apparently was 4 years over, so not even close. Clearly used an excellent moisturiser to make him look suitably young. Rivera did apparently say in an interview that every player in that squad was too old, but I don't think that's actually been verified. But the complaints came from Guatemala and USA, and really because the Mexican organisation, the Mexican Football Federation, complained about it quite vociferously. I wonder whether that also contributed to the punishment, the obvious lack of corruption. And it was revealed by Mexicans, and it's important to say that this is a Mexican investigation by a guy called Antonio Moreno from a public TV network that did all the investigating. It came out on on a newspaper called Ovaciones. So it's interesting that it wasn't an investigation carried out abroad. Sometimes you might wonder whether national press might cover it up in the greater good. You wonder if the journalists would regret it when they weren't allowed to play in the 1988 Olympics or the 1990 World Cup. But probably gave him the story of a lifetime. So the Cachirules scandal feels like potentially an over harsh punishment. But I wonder whether this was also a thing that was becoming increasingly prevalent in global football. There have been various rumours about it. There have been various stories about this kind of age rule being frequently manipulated and the lack of checks. So whether this is one of those exemplary punishments that fit in with a lot of other tick box exercises, I think that kind of aspect of the cynicism might be a fair comment.
Okay, so we'll let the USA off from any involvement, or FIFA thinking it was all about the USA. I'll step down that particular conspiracy theory.
Only slightly, though, I think.
Oh yeah, only slightly. I mean, I think it's still true. They desperately wanted the USA to get to 1990 ahead of 94. But anyway, in Mexico's story, well, after that odd departure from a tournament, shall we say, they then went into a run of qualifying comfortably and regularly. An incredible run of reaching the last 16 at 7 World Cups in a row, only to lose at that stage every single time. It's a run that was only ended at that last tournament in Qatar. Quite another tale of misfortune. It wasn't a run ended in a good way, I should hasten to add. It was a run ended in a bad way. A lot of tales of missed opportunity in this long run of last 16 departures, certainly. Have to throw in here, if people like to talk about Tottenham being very Spursy when they screw things up and throw them away, perhaps the international equivalent is being Mexico-y. I'm coining that one. An incredible run.
Consistency in mediocrity.
Absolutely. Mexico seemed to serve well in that regard. They flatter to deceive. They perform brilliantly in the group stage at times. They do really, really well. Some excellent results, but they just do it too damn soon, I think, is the key, and then a fall flat when they could have gone further. It is an incredible run, though. Both good performances, as I say, largely in the group. Disappointment. It's a glass ceiling that they only seem to be able to break through when at home. So interesting what might happen this summer, although I don't know that any quarterfinal would even happen at home this time around. But, 1917-86, they managed that absolutely fine to get through the last 16, or in 1970, that was just the group. But it's always a step too far for them away from home. So missed opportunities. Let's get into some of these. 1994, they did very well in their group. It was the stereotypical group of death, wasn't it? They were in with Italy and Ireland and Norway. Everybody finished level on points, but Mexico finished top of the pile thanks to the goals they'd scored. And that took them into a last 16 game with Bulgaria. Now, okay, this was Bulgaria of Stoichkov, Lechkov, Sirikov, Balakov, many other ovs who were a very, very good team and obviously would go on, as we all know, to reach the semi-finals. But this was a game Mexico were coming into in a better state of affairs, or on a bigger high, I would guess, of having performed so well. Bulgaria took advantage of Argentina's chaos in the groups, really, to get to where they got to. It was a strange game, a red card apiece for apparently nothing, and that caused it to go a bit flat. And ultimately, Mexico lost to Bulgaria on penalties. Disappointing, especially when it's just across the border in the USA, the support Mexico received there. I remember particularly well the game they played with Ireland in Orlando, which okay, it would have been more Mexican support had they been in California, possibly at that stage. But still, this was huge swathes of Mexican support, and they always will be well supported in the USA. So probably particularly frustrating from that regard, as well as the footballing side.
No, I think you're absolutely right. The conditions you would think would suit them quite a lot. You're absolutely right about the power of home support. I mean, it's, one of the USA great problems is the fact that whenever they play Mexico in the United States, the Mexicans have a lot better support, more numerous support than the USA does. Whether Trump is deliberately trying to change that, maybe Trump is just a massive football fan and he's trying to even up the numbers with the ICE and the deportation policies. I mean, is this another?
There's a conspiracy for you. Yeah,
there we go. We'll kind of launch that one.
That visa application is now going to be messed up forever, Pete. Sorry.
Even harder now. Now that kind of soccer chiefs are thinking about this as well. We know they all listen to the podcast. It's one of those interesting things because I think the Mexican team, again, it's one of those Mexican teams I think always feels like it's a couple of players slightly short of a team that could go that extra stage. I think that in this particular era, we slightly probably have that the forward that they need is not there. Probably a characteristic of all their group actually in the original stages. But Hugo Sanchez is really past it. None of their other strikers really stakes a great claim. Really, the two star players are Luis Garcia, scores a lovely goal in the group games. Probably Claudio Suarez as a defender is making his kind of his claim to one of the great centre backs of Mexican history. He's known as the Emperor, one of the great players that would accompany Marquez for a while. You've also got Jorge Campos, the person who made fluorescent colours a real must for goalkeeping shirts. But it's a solid team. It's quite unspectacular. And it does feel like, Bulgaria, there was something about them that World Cup, wasn't it? I mean, that was the team that also gave all kinds of jokes about what Bulgarian teams were called in terms of, Jerkov might be playing for them, Hujanika Bolakov might be playing for them. That was that kind of team that created that joke, wasn't it? It's also, I think, the first time Mexico have a player sent off at a World Cup, which again is quite an impressive record. That for all the times they've qualified, they probably have got one of the better disciplinary records in terms of sendings off. I think it was Jorge Aguirre, one of their most well-known managers on an international level, that was the guy sent off. But yeah, it's the first of opportunities missed. And again, if we're kind of thinking about conspiracy theories, is the rise of the cartels and in the Mexican drug cartels in this time slightly creating a tendency for Mexico to shoot themselves in the foot? Is that kind of violence of Mexican society spreading towards football? So there's the kind of political scientist in me finding odd comparisons.
Perfect. Well, I mean, the farcical nature of that particular match, all the bizarre refereeing and so on, was nicely summed up when the goal collapsed at one point as well.
Yeah.
So that was a particularly memorable occasion. But yeah, Stoichkov was the big star on the day. I suppose it is frustrating because that was a chance to get through to quarterfinal, where Germany awaited, and it wasn't a vintage Germany. But I guess we're seeing a bit of the impact of the ban for some of these players as well. So they've missed out on the potential for a World Cup. People like you mentioned there, Sanchez, he did make it to 94, I think, and only played a short stint.
Yeah.
I think. But
could have done a bit more time, but yeah.
And 1990 would have sat far better for him.
Yeah.
And probably for several others too. But then we move on to 1998. And here we have another fine group performance. Guys win over Korea. They come back from goals down against both Belgium and the Netherlands to tie 2-0 down on both occasions. We've got Luis Hernandez, all his blonde flowing locks.
The budget
scoring. The budget Perfect. The budget Canija scoring plenty, and he scored again in the round of 16 against Germany, taking the lead, but they lost out again to 2 late goals. This tournament for me, for Mexico, amid the frustrations, it sticks in the mind for, well, I was going to say 2 things. There's actually 3. One is, of course, Hernandez and his late goals and hair. Fantastic. The next is their kit, which I think there's echoes of in their current one with the Aztec symbols kind of embedded within it. I do like that, I have to say. And the third is for the bunny hop. This is where we saw, I'm going to butcher his name here, Cuauhtemoc Blanco.
Perfect.
I'm sure that's exactly how you pronounce it in Mayan dialect. Yeah. Blanco with his bunny hop, I think he brought it in in the first game against Korea, just leaping his way through two defenders there. It's a fantastic move. It deserves to be better known.
Yeah, it's one of the few moves that has really got the name for it. The Quatemila. It's one of those. It just doesn't seem to be repeated either. And you'd think it would be, given the amount of kind of pressing that goes on with two players looking to close down players. Now you think it'd be the kind of ideal tactic to beat them. But yeah, I mean, along with the Cruyff turn and the Panenka and so on, it's one of few moves that has a player's name trademarked against it. And yeah, this was his arrival. He became, again, him and Hernandez probably. If you and I looked at a few like best ever teams of Mexico, the best World Cup 11s, and most of them have Blanco and Hernandez in them as the goal scorers that really made an impact. And I think this tournament is certainly one of the reasons why. Certainly the next one as well. Blanco is a figure for quite a few World Cups, and it says something about the fact that Hugo Sanchez never really did it. In the World Cups he played, not even in 1986, really, that someone like Luis Hernandez and Blanco, and then again you've got Chicharito a little bit later on, are the forwards that most people would select for Mexicans anyway. And I think what's good about this one is that I don't think there's that huge expectations. Mexico hadn't played particularly well in the qualifiers beforehand, but they seem to have a bit of a knack of coming back late, stealing goals when it mattered. So in lots of ways, to get out of the group against Belgium, against South Korea, and against Holland was a pretty remarkable achievement, particularly in the way they did it with Hernandez's late goal. So and I wonder whether it's just that's a team that that a lot of Mexicans hold very fondly because of that. There was a lot of personality there as well. The one shame is that they go down really in a situation where they could have won. I watched some of the headlines of this, and it does feel like Germany, like Mexico have the chances to win it. There's quite a lot of chances they miss. And arguably the goal that is conceded at the end, Campos just seems to freeze. For that last goal, I think it's Bierhoff, isn't it? And the header. And it just seems like Campos is just stuck and then just dives forlornly after the ball's actually already in the net. So that felt like one of those very cruel moments in Mexican football history, which for a lot of that team will remember pretty painfully, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And that your mention of Campos again there is reminding me of something I saw recently. Speaking of painful moments in Mexican history, you talked about his kits there when you mentioned in USA. He was very flamboyant, but I saw something of the reserve goalkeepers who, because of the FIFA rules of the tournament, have to have the same kit.
Oh, yeah.
You couldn't have different goalkeepers' kits. So these reserve guys had to wear, and you see them on the bench, it was very hot, they're all sat there and nothing covering it up in their bright fluorescent kit, looking thoroughly annoyed with the situation. And indeed, that's what they were chatting about on this thing I saw. So their frustration with Campos, and they didn't even get a game. He got all the glory ahead of them.
Yeah.
Okay,
imagine if they were really more. Imagine if they were even more charismatic than he was. Just imagine if that was possible. Or were they really kind of boring accountancy types that would have been rather seen dead in anything but that? So
exactly, they took their inspiration from Peter Shilton, probably.
Yeah, they didn't get on
line.
the Adidas adverts just for wearing a nice kit, did they? So, or Nike or whatever advert that was. When was it the Nike one where they're in a gladiatorial arena and Campos was the goalkeeper in that one? It was that kind of era, wasn't it?
With Cantona.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so it's their own fault for not being flamboyant enough. So, yeah, there we go. Right, we'll move into the new century now. Off the back of Mexico actually winning the Confederations Cup in 1999. That's something to put a feather in their cap for.
Triumph, yeah. That and the Olympics in 2012, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. They did defeat the USA in the semi-finals in that before beating Brazil in the final. So it was an impressive achievement. Speaking of USA, when we get to 2002, there's a bit of a date with destiny here with the USA. Again, another superb group performance. Top in the group. They beat Croatia and Ecuador and then drew with Italy, where they probably should have won. A fantastic flicked header from Borghetti, I think it was, in that particular game. Superb goal. Now, it's definitely well worth looking up. I mean, he's not even looking in the right direction, glances it into the far corner. It's absolutely magnificent. But that gets them out of that group, top of the group, and into a last 16 game with the USA. Now, this is Well, it's a country they play very, very often, of course. They're very familiar with them. They probably, to my mind anyway, or maybe this is my own naive way of looking at it, would view themselves as superior in terms of football to the USA, despite repeated evidence probably to the contrary, or maybe this was the starting point of that evidence to the contrary. Really, is the USA improved? This is the USA of Landon Donovan coming through at this stage. So they are starting to emerge as a far stronger core generation of players than they had been before. So maybe still at this point, it's correct that Mexico should feel superior, but it was a major disappointment, wasn't it? Did they underestimate the USA? Were they complacent? Were they just outdone by a team that had a bit more about them on the day, a bit more desire?
Yeah, no, I think it's all of those things. I think Javier Aguirre, who is coaching the Mexican team, accepts that this is one of his biggest tactical blunders. Again, they think they're overly confident. They probably play an extra attacker that they don't really need to. That leaves them fairly open on the break. USA are smart enough to take advantage. And as you say, they've got a few decent players now who are making a bit of an impact. They've had the experience of the 1994 World Cup at home, which has given them given their players credibility, a bit of access, brought a bit more of a footballing culture. But this is the game that Mexico can't lose or shouldn't lose, and hurts very deeply because it is the great border rival. All of the national narratives historically, go back to this enmity rivalry between Mexico and the USA. Again, it's worth remembering for those who don't know that in a war between Mexico and the US in 1846 to 1848, Mexico loses a third of its national territory. All the places like New Mexico, Texas, California, Nevada, Arizona, Colorado, I think Utah as well, are all lost. So that creates a lot of pain. You then have, decades of othering from USA politics, from in USA films. There is always the Mexican figure as the outlaw, the bandit, the rival, the criminal. So to lose to the USA in a sport that Mexicans would consider to be one of their national sports, if not their major national sports, against a nation that doesn't even consider it as a sport, really, apart from for their women, then that is a real problem. So Aguirre gets it very wrong. And again, a talented generation. We have Javier, we have Marquez, the great captain. The back is there. Gerardo Torrado, one of the great centre midfielders, hard-working kind of box-to-box player is there as well. Garcia Aspe is again featuring still. Blanco is a little bit more experienced. Again, that header by Borghetti, which it just doesn't seem possible. That again, that's a header. It's one of those goals that I don't think if anyone tried to do it, they could actually manage it. It's just bafflingly difficult. So to get it wrong at that occasion is a real disaster. It's a little bit like the Colombia versus USA game in 1994. You come in thinking we'll beat this lot of rubbish, and then it just goes wrong. So I think that's one of those that they will rue greatly, just because of all the political, cultural meanings that are implicit within it.
Absolutely. And as we touched on, then it did usher in an era where the USA kind of had Mexico's measure when it came to football. The dos a cero, as the Americans would term it, mockingly taunting the Mexicans when it came to football. This was, I guess, the first of those. And then there were a number of these similar victories in World Cup qualifying, in CONCACAF Gold Cup, and so on. So, yeah, definitely a turning of the tide. Significant disappointment, a hell of a gut punch, I suppose. And then we come into the following couple of tournaments. Now, for those keeping count, we've had 3 round of 16 exits in a row. We're about to get a couple more. Very Mexico-y, very Mexico-y. The next 2 tournaments, they went out to the same team at the same stage in slightly different circumstances, though. So they lost to Argentina in the last 16 of both 2006 and 2010. In 2006, possibly the more disappointing of the two, they did go close. They'd taken the lead early on through Rafa Marquez, one of the players you mentioned there, and he's a player of incredible longevity when it comes to Mexican football and performing in the World Cup. They did ultimately lose to a stunning Maxi Rodriguez goal in extra time. It probably has similarities to the Germany one in 98, doesn't it, where they're playing a big nation, take the lead, run them close, but ultimately are beaten away by the traditional successful team, probably. So, yeah, disappointment. In 2010, to carry on this theme, they were up against the chaos of Maradona that time. Maradona coached Argentina rather than playing, and somehow he managed to get his team to win 3-1. Maybe there's an inferiority complex at play, perhaps, or something like that.
Yeah, it's a concept that we talked about a lot on the erstwhile South American files, now La Pausa, brought to this platform as well.
Look it up, folks. Yes.
Yeah. But it's, we talk a lot about hierarchy, hierarchy, and that's a really important concept in Latin American football, that there is a historic tradition of who wins and who doesn't, who is above and who is below. The most famous example of it, Maradona in 1993, before the Colombia 5 Argentina game, says, this will be the same as always. History says that Argentina are up here, and Colombia are down here, with a kind of noise kind of thing. And I think Mexico are very much in the same boat. The hierarchy of the continent would dictate that Argentina wins. And once again, I think in lots of ways, Mexico, again, can't quite manage to defeat that sense of hierarchy. In lots of ways, it feels like 2010 was the worst one. The Maradona kind of whole tenure was one ruled by constant changes, controversies, lack of tactical awareness. In that particular game, there's a goal which really shouldn't have counted that Argentina scored. That dents Mexico, that gets them a lot, pretty angry in lots of ways. So that game is remembered for that particular instant. The 2006 one feels like it's just the frustration of not quite managing it after playing a really good game against probably a more organised team in lots of ways. So, again, two slightly different reasons, two slightly different sentiments possibly, but once again, the Mexico-y feeling that they're becoming very, very used to.
And had they got through in either of these, I think they'd have run straight into Germany on both occasions, which would have been a tall order. But again, it would have been a quarterfinal. They and I totally skirted over it, but the group stages in both of these were pretty comfortable for Mexico, did quite well. Took advantage, I suppose, in 2010 of France's implosion. But, you still got to beat what's in front of you, and they did that very well. And they also spoiled South Africa's big day on the opening day. Rafa Marquez, again, a centre-back who scores an awful lot of goals.
Which comes up from the back and gets the big goal when you need it,
He does, yeah.
Proper
superb player, absolutely. Which brings us to 2014 and Brazil, and I guess this follows basically the same pattern. I hesitate to go for the catchphrase again, but we are following the pattern once more. Another good group stage. They beat Cameroon, beat Croatia in what was effectively a playoff for the last 16, and they drew 0-0 with the host, the only team to avoid defeat to them in the group. Came out as group runners-up and then faced the Netherlands in the last 16. Now, the Dutch, they've been playing very well, of course. They'd had some spectacular moments in the group themselves, notably against Spain, of course. But Mexico took the lead yet again. Giovanni Dos Santos on this occasion just after half-time. And they held that until the 88th minute when Wesley Sneijder equalised, and then the same pattern. They lose in extra time. A Huntelaar penalty on this occasion. Same old story all over again. And on this occasion, if you look forward again, I know it's kind of foolish too, isn't it? But you can't help but think, had they been able to hold on, a quarterfinal against Costa Rica awaited. Yeah. Now, okay, England know that Costa Rica performed very well in that World Cup and won that group. But again, it's a foe Mexico were very familiar with, had played regularly, probably would feel superior to. Would have been opportunity for an even... Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the hierarchy was very much in their favour against Costa Rica. And you have the potential of getting all the way to a semi-final. Goodness me, what a missed opportunity. It was a decent Dutch team, don't get me wrong. It was a very good Dutch team, but Mexico had them in position. They had the win within their grasp.
Yeah, and a slightly more reliable goalkeeper who was having a great tournament. I think that, Campos was always a little bit dodgy on crosses, but it's worth looking at. It's Memo Ochoa in this particular tournament that's in goal for Mexico. And he's one of those goalkeepers that I can't quite work out why he's never played at a bigger team. He's kind of, he kind of, was in Bastia or something like that in France or Jackie, I can't remember which it was, but never really got the move he deserved. But he was brilliant against Brazil. Mexico, I don't think have ever scored against Brazil in the 3 or 4 times that they've played against them. So that was a little bit of a red letter day. Again, some good players in the squad. The likes of Andres Guardado was one of their finest kind of number 8 players. Giovanni Dos Santos was probably one of those players that was always better for Mexico than he was maybe at club sides. That's possibly maybe unfair, but Miguel Layún, fans of Watford might remember him with possible fondness, who knows. Again, Chicharito's playing in that tournament as well, so a good side. But yeah, this is the story of the late show, of not quite being able to hold out. That's the particular tale of Mexico-iness. I wonder if there's a Spanish version we could Esporzianismo, possibly. But yeah, it's a slightly different story. The result is the same. The curse of the last 16 strikes again.
And it's interesting when we talk of the hierarchy there, that when it came to it in a knockout game, they couldn't do it, but occasionally they had done in the group stages. Yeah. So you mentioned there the goalless draw with Brazil, hosts Brazil, with everything in their favour, and on a bit of a roll, and it went wrong for them later in the tournament. But Mexico could hold their own against these nations. They'd done so in Copa America tournaments as well. But when it really came to the crunch,
beating Croatia 3-1, you've got people like Perisic in that team, and a lot of players in very, very good European leagues, much more probable pedigree at least than the Mexico side had, or the squad had. So that's, that kind of win is a very strong result. Maybe it's not quite the Croatia that Croatia would become 4 years later, but still that's a good squad.
No, absolutely. And then moving on to 2018, they again beat a major football nation in their opening game. This was the World Cup holders, no less, Germany. And okay, history tells us they went out in the group stage, but nobody thought that at the start of the tournament. And Mexico beat them 1-0, Herving Chucky Lozano with the winning goal, which left Mexico in a great position in this, what was a very tough, close group with 4 good teams, South Korea and Sweden, the others. They edged past South Korea 2-1 in the second game. They did lose 3-0 to Sweden in the final game, while Korea were busy knocking Germany out in the other match. This left Mexico in runners-up spot when they could have won the group. Now, the implications here, I think Mexico did change their lineup a little bit against Sweden because they'd had 2 victories. They were through, and they opted to rest a few people and ended up getting thumped. That let Sweden win the group in combination with Korea's win against Germany. Mexico probably banking on Germany getting the win there, and that would have left Mexico top of the group. Instead, then, of facing Switzerland in the last 16, lo and behold, they have to face Brazil instead. Well, we all know what's going to happen now, don't we? We've seen it before. We all know what's about to happen. Can you guess what happened next? Yeah, they lost. Cut to the chase, they lost. And again, it's the frustration that again and again of the missed opportunities. Had they taken the Sweden game more seriously, maybe they just still have lost. Who knows? But had they got a draw and clung on and won the group, or had things gone differently in the other game and they'd ended up winning the group, a last 16 against Switzerland, they wouldn't have this inferiority. The hierarchy would have, left them on par perhaps, or left Mexico feeling confident. Whereas against Brazil, everybody knew what was going to happen.
Yeah. And they weren't even in that game. Again, if you look at the highlights, it's a Memo Ochoa versus Firmino, Willian, Neymar, who are kind of lots of shots. Ochoa has a good game, keeps it to 2-0. Mexico retain their record of never scoring against Brazil in the World Cup. So that's one for. I'm not sure if they can play them in this World Cup at some point, but if they do, get down the bookies and put a few quid on Mexico not scoring. That's what history tells you. Again, it's the way they go out after such a great start to lose 2 games pretty convincingly and pretty one-sidedly makes it one of the less rude departures in the last 16. Probably it's certainly not up there with the USA. It feels like more of an inevitability. A pretty limp performance by their standards, I think. Again, not an amazing squad. Erving Lozano is the again one of the few footballers to be named after a horror figure. He's really the figure that breaks out in that particular team. But it's not a strong generation, really. And I think that follows through to the next squad as well. We don't see, a vintage Mexican crop of players. Some of them are slightly on their way out. Rafa Marquez by now is really on his last legs. Guardado is still around. Chicharito is still around, but don't really have very much impact on this tournament, unfortunately.
And that brings us to 7 tournaments in a row now for Mexico, where they failed to reach the quarterfinals, having got to the last 16. An impressive achievement, I think we can all agree, whilst also being a massive, massive disappointment and frustration. I mean, joking aside, it is impressive how they've got through the group every single time.
I think it's the kind of thing that Scotland would kill for. Scotland trying to going out the group stages. As a half Scot myself, I think we'd be desperate for a record that says get to the last 16 every time. That would make a lot better historical reading. It would,
yes. So let's not criticize too much. They are getting to the last 16 of the world very regularly. Quite an achievement. But yes, they could have got further on a couple of those occasions. In the last World Cup then in Qatar 2022, they did not reach the last 16. They took their misfortune in a new direction, throwing away a place. We've just brought the misfortune a little earlier here, haven't we? They threw away a place in the last 16 in the final moments of the group against an already eliminated opponent. And that, again, is deeply frustrating, very Mexico-y once again. They'd had a goalless draw with Poland in their opening game, Guillermo Ochoa saving Robert Lewandowski's penalty kick. So that was a good start. Then they came into a game against Argentina. Argentina had already lost to Saudi Arabia, which was one of the rare occasions we were all jumping around in support of Saudi success in sport, because let's face it, it was hilarious when they beat Argentina.
Very funny.
But that meant Argentina were deeply under pressure when they faced Mexico. I remember it vividly. A lot of the talk at the time was, can Mexico eliminate Argentina here? Because they were so nervous. The first half of this match, you could visibly see it. Argentina were within themselves. They weren't able to play in their usual way. They weren't able to play the way they soon would in this World Cup as they progressed all the way to the final. Some of the slick moves, the fine interplay, the quality plays just weren't shown. They were all a bundle of nerves. So they were there for the taking for Mexico. That did change, obviously, in the second half. They failed to twist the knife, I suppose, against this very nervous opponent. Messi scores in the second half. Argentina go on to win 2-0. Their confidence is restored, and the rest is history for them. That left Mexico with a final match against Saudi Arabia. They needed a few things to happen. They needed to beat Saudi Arabia, and they needed Poland to lose to Argentina, and they also had to hope for a difference of 4 goals in the goal difference, a bit of a swing. Now, with Poland losing 2-0 to Argentina and Mexico winning 2-0 versus Saudi Arabia, it was all on. Stunning Luis Chavez free kick to make it 2-0 after an excellent goal from Henry Martin as well, only a minute or two earlier. Again, huge numbers of Mexicans in the crowd. I think the Latin Americans travel to Qatar more than anybody else.
Yeah.
Certainly the case for the Mexicans here. But they were minutes away. They're set for the last 16. Everything that needed to happen is happening. It's perfect. Yeah. What could possibly go wrong? And this is one of those cases where it was the endings of the group like this that was key in many ways to Infantino realizing, 4-team groups are far better than 3-team groups. We better have those when it comes to the next World Cup. Failing to appreciate that it's only because 2 got to go through from those 4-team groups that made it so dramatic. But that's another story. Mexico, they're moments away, and they managed to throw it all away by conceding an injury time consolation goal to Saudi. Mexico still won the game. They still got the 3 points, but that one goal caused the goal difference swing to fail, and it saw them eliminated and sending Poland through instead. Incredible way to screw it up.
I mean, you've got to admire the creativity and range of the repertoire of finding ways to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. It's quite an achievement. I mean, I kind of found that Mexico team to be very forgettable. I don't quite know why. They didn't seem to really have anything particularly impressive about them. Functional, maybe. I don't know. Again, it's just, I think the Argentina game is such a kind of turning point in history, isn't it? That could have been the end of La Scaloneta. And as it's turned out, Scaloni's become an absolute legend. Messi's finally being consecrated as, not quite at the same level as Maradona, but not far off it. Obviously, lots of different meanings involved there, which we won't go into. But again, I mean, whether Mexico have the quality to really twist the knife, as you say, I don't really think they did. So yeah, again, it's one of those what could have been moments. But I don't think that would have been a side that would have gone really any further. I don't think they really had much about them. So yeah, again, Mexico-iness in the best way that we've come to love and expect.
Exactly. They just brought it forwards just to keep us guessing a little bit,
Yeah.
I suppose. It saved us the pain of yet another last 16 exit, didn't it? So, well, that's brought us up to date then. Obviously, we now have the 2026 World Cup coming up for Mexico. That will make them the first country to host 3 World Cups, or partial host, I guess we should say, this time around. The Azteca will be used again, and I think by the end of this tournament that it will, if it isn't already, the most used stadium in World Cup history. Possibly the Maracanã is the only one to rank anywhere near it, really. It will have that accolade. Mexico are only playing host to 13 matches, though, which is the same as Canada, talking about on the pod I did with them. It doesn't feel satisfactory enough, really. It's not a co-hosting so much as a USA tournament with a couple of games thrown either side of their border. It is, absolutely. So it's not going to feel Mexican, I think, is my point here. It won't feel like a Mexican World Cup like 1970, like 1986.
Although I wonder whether
that's a shame.
Do you think the spectacle will be better though in Mexico than it will be in the USA? Certainly, given all the visa restrictions. I mean, Mexico and the Mexican president said we won't. Everyone will be coming in. So I wonder whether those 13 games will be more of what we expect the World Cup to really be as a spectacle. I don't know what you think.
No, that's a great point. And exactly the same could be said for Canada, I suppose. Yeah. There aren't these restrictions of people traveling. It'd be far more welcoming. Yeah, that's really great shout. It would be really interesting to see if the away fan contingent, if you like, the traveling fan support is better for those countries who are fortunate enough to have their group stages in Mexico or Canada.
Return of the proper Mexican wave.
Yes. Oh, good. Yes, that has to happen. That has to happen. It will be disappointing if not.
That would be a sign of the game is gone, wouldn't it? If there's no Mexican wave, the game is truly gone in Latin America.
Absolutely. No, they've got themselves a decent draw as well. They've got South Africa in the opening game, just as was the case in 2010. The roles reversed this time, I suppose. And they have South Korea and Czech Republic. So surely even they can't screw up this group this time.
History's on their side, I mean, beating South Korea in 1998, Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic rather than Czechoslovakia, but obviously being one of their famous victories in the World Cup. So the omens are pretty good. Home team advantage always has been beneficial for them briefly. Getting to the last 16 means getting technically around further this time as well. So all kind of omens in some kind of favour anyway. I think it's such an interesting time for Mexico to host it, and I think the USA and all the controversies with Trump and the ICE issues and visa issues and Greenland and the invasion of Venezuela and the capturing of Nicolas Maduro and all this, it kind of meant Mexico as hosts and the problems that exist there have flown under the radar somewhat. Mexico still has a lot of problems. The cartels are still a big issue. Although it is true to say, and it's very important to say, that homicides and violence have gone down quite significantly during the Claudia Sheinbaum regime. However, the recent capture and eventual death of El Mencho, one of the most infamous and long-sought leaders of the Mexican cartels, did lead to a brief spike in violence. It doesn't seem to have been accompanied by the usual kind of spike in violence as different cartels jockey for position and control of the different plazas, but it did put Mexico briefly in the spotlight again. And it's been interesting just how much more there has been a fear of the games in Mexico compared to all of the issues that the USA has. Again, a lot of those come from, you could argue complicity of journalists not wanting to, offend their paymasters up on high, all of the sponsorship deals potentially. But, there are questions in Mexico over security. I wonder which is more dangerous. Where are there more guns? Who knows? Mexico has, again, in the previous occasion when they've hosted these tournaments, there weren't the same amount of cartel issues. I don't expect there to be any this time either. but it will be interesting just to see, with such a major tournament and so many tensions going around it, there is the potential there for any types of violence, whether in the USA or Mexico, to really raise questions about the hosting and about the host countries and about the securitization, the violences, the prevalence of firearms in both countries. So we'll see. We hope nothing like that happens, but it's there for someone to make a story of if something does happen.
Absolutely, the conditions are there with these hosts that we have on the football field. It will be interesting to see if they can break through their glass ceiling, or at least get as far as they did when they'd hosted previously. Although this time they'd have to come through another knockout round. So you can just see what's going to happen is they'll get out of the group, they'll win their round of 32 knockout match, they'll get through a knockout, everything will be great, only to hit the last 16 and stumble again. But we will see.
Yeah, it feels like the one thing they haven't yet managed to how they haven't managed to lose a game is the own goal. So maybe that's the punt. It's like some unfortunate Mexican guy steers one past his keeper in the dying second. So again, that feels like the creativity that Mexico has might be the way.
Yeah. Let's hope for that then. Excellent. But of course, if they do reach the last 16, they will have got into their fifth game, and that is something they've never done before. So let's just make the tournament bigger and bigger, and they can get more games while still going out at the last 16. Yeah. Let's bring a few other points before we round up. Mexico, for me, is a nation that's had a number of fantastic players. So we've got Hugo Sanchez, chief among them. We've got Aidan Negrete from 86, Luis Garcia, 94, Luis Hernandez and his golden flowing locks, the budget Canija in 98. We mentioned Rafa Marquez in many, many tournaments, Borghetti, Lozano, and so on. With all of this talent, and maybe not the depth, but certainly they've had great talent. For a football-mad nation of a huge population with a fair amount of football history by this stage, they, to me, feel like one of the great unfulfilled football nations. I feel, anyway, they should be better than they are. Maybe I'm perceiving them along the lines of a major South American nation and thinking a country of that size, football mad, Latin American, therefore they should be more of a contender. Whereas Mexico is obviously from a different part of the world, a different history, a different levels of footballing opportunity, given where they're located, although they have been part of Copa America for quite a while now. What do you think, Pete? I just find, and you could mention this about countries in other parts of the world with huge football-mad populations where they've just never quite got it together. Mexico have got it together to a certain amount, but I'm just always left feeling that there should be more.
It's one of those great questions, isn't it? I mean, I think if you look at two main things that Mexico maybe don't have or don't do that other countries in Latin America anyway that do is, Mexico are in CONCACAF rather than CONMEBOL. How much are they challenged there? Do they get that level of competitive games that maybe they require? As you say, they have played in Copa America, but with a definite attempt to try and achieve that. That was really one of the reasons why they pushed for it. It's also economic reasons for South Americans, the viewing public, the money that comes in from the Mexican market makes, invite them to the Copa to the Copa America a bonus. They have played in the Libertadores a few times as well, some of the Mexican clubs. So that's one issue. Do they have enough competitive football? The second issue is how many players are playing in the very best leagues. Again, there was a long tradition for a long time for Mexican players not to leave Mexico. Hugo Sanchez was one of very few that did. It's become more regular since then. We've obviously seen a few players in the Premier League, the likes of Borghetti, Jimenez, Layun, a few others, not in the same numbers as obviously Argentinians, Uruguayans, Brazilians, Colombians even. Maybe not even, I don't know, actually, maybe whether Ecuadorians, thinking of Agustin Delgado of Southampton and others, maybe a few more than Ecuador. But if you look at the current squad as well, there are not many that are playing at a very high level in Europe. And again, I don't think that should always be the be-all and end-all. However, a lot of the games, again, a lot of some of the most competitive leagues, the most competitive cups are played there. The Mexican league is still good. It's a very competitive league, well-financed. They do have the money to get a lot of decent South American players to come to Mexico, potentially as one of their destinations before going to Europe. But I just wonder whether that the level of competitivity is lacking. Is it possible? Maybe a slight lack of professionalism. Again, these are all very very speculative. I wonder whether it's the weight of history. Does that impede them? Is that a big reason? Every country has certain narratives that that seems to become a truism. Can England take penalties? Can Colombia do it when it really matters? Can Mexico get past the last 16? There are certain historic, often history weighs very heavily because it's what the media talks about. It's what the players know because that's what they're brought up on. It's what the fans know. And these kind of imponderables, of memory, of tradition in lots of ways, are sometimes quite hard to break. If and when that dam bursts, then you kind of feel weight of history is off. Everything is a bonus. Are we the greatest Mexican team ever? I'm not sure if the team that they've got at the moment is going to break that mold. Again, it's one of those teams that if you were to say, who do you know of it? I'm not sure many, great football experts or the fairly knowledgeable fan will know many. And that, in a very global game is quite surprising now. It's not something that features regularly. So I think those are possibly the reasons, but I think you're right. With the tradition, the history, the love of football, the clubs they have, some very, very good players. And again, I think the other issue is whether they've had, 5 or 6 of them at the same time, whether they've had enough of them in the real core positions. I think that's another reason. They've had some good forwards, but maybe not the playmaker. They've had some very good centre-backs, but they haven't got the forwards that will score the goals. So that unfortunate squad composition could also be a reason.
Okay, well, we'll see how they get on. But as we've seen here, it is largely a tale of heartbreak and disappointment. Which of these many missed opportunities, Pete, would you say was the most painful for Mexico?
It's got to be the USA one. It's just because of the rivalry, of the political meaning, of the social meaning, of the tactical errors, of a team that had a lot going for it. I think you can't look beyond that one from what the game meant. It's probably not the closest they came in terms of performance, but that's the one for me. Don't know, what do you think?
I like it because the extra context is all, isn't it? There's so much loaded onto that game in terms of history of the nations, in terms of regional standing, in terms of expectations. And I think that's probably the key, the expectation of victory when it didn't happen. Whereas some of these others, they've come close to knocking out bigger teams and just fallen short. And that's very frustrating, like the 88th minute goal from Snyder. I think that's probably the other one I would go to because they were so close and the path was opening up for them. Yeah. That's a huge, huge frustration. But yeah, you don't have that extra context. And we like that kind of thing here, don't we? So that's definitely a good shout there. Favorite Mexican World Cup player?
It's probably the budget Canija. Again, very harsh on Luis Hernandez.
Magnificent.
But again, he was a man for big moments. Personality, bit of flair. Scored 4 goals in World Cups, did it when it really mattered. There's a lot to like there. I still, for random reasons, in terms of 1986 was my first ever Panini soccer album. And I don't know why, but I quite liked the name of Miguel España. This is before I actually studied Spanish. And you always, it's one of those things that you always remember certain stickers in that album. And for some reason, that was one. I don't think
Michael Spain.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't sound as good, does it?
No, I mean, it's quite an average name, but it's quite a decent midfielder. And I think he got 70-odd caps. I don't know the actual number. In terms of sheer maverickness, and again, on the La Pausa now podcast, we enjoy a maverick. Then Cuauhtémoc Blanco ticks a lot of boxes, because he also had the audacity to go into politics afterwards, and that's always exciting. And he's had a few scandals, a lot of them, heavily caveated with allegedly being photoed with some people you probably shouldn't be photoed with in Mexico, but he has always pointed out. Lots of people want their photos taken with me. I don't know who they all are. The fact that he invented his own move deserves a huge amount of credit. So there was something about him that had personality as well and moved outside of that solid player that you didn't really know much more about apart from they were solid. He had a bit more about him.
No, excellent. Okay, then on the a final point here, and you're talking of '86 and Panini and all of that. My '86 memory of Mexico comes from my Subutio kit, which was a World Cup themed one.
Oh, lovely.
And at the point it came out, there was only two teams qualified, which were Italy and Mexico. So they were the two kits that came with it, the two teams that came with it. Sorry. So yeah, I loved my little Mexican team. They did very well. A few of them suffered injuries when I stepped on them, but it was all good. But my theory on kits, I've mentioned it many, many times. A good kit equals a good tournament. They had a great kit in '86. They had Mexico emblazoned across the back, and they got to the quarterfinal. They've got a good kit this time around. I will leave.
They did have a great away kit last time round, though. Spectacular Aztec designs.
Okay, I might need to tweak my theory for away kits.
The away one, does it work as well? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. The away one doesn't hold as much power. I think that must be it.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move to our and finally stoppage time section, or the Stephen Scragg section, as we like to term it here. We're going back to the day after the night before, Pete. Mexico is all upset again. They've lost on penalties to West Germany in the home World Cup of 1986. They could and, well, maybe should have got through. But no, instead, we're all crying in our rooms listening to the charts on the radio. The Edge of Heaven by Wham is at number one. That's twisting the knife a little bit there because they did not make it to the Edge of Heaven at all. Pete, what do you fancy from this?
Yeah, I mean, if we carry on from that theme of songs that kind of summarize how they might have felt, Owen Paul's My Favorite Waste of Time, does that summarize Mexico's performances in World Cups? Maybe the Mexican fans were singing along to the Doctor and the Medics classic Spirit in the Sky and praying for some kind of divine intervention that never came. Madonna was Papa Don't Preaching. Well, obviously the papas in the Mexican household weren't preaching either. Did the result hit them like a sledgehammer by Peter Gabriel?
This is good, Pete.
Thank you. I've got more. Can we have a little raspberry noise for each one? Basically, were they singing "Do you want to please me" along with Samantha Fox, and then finding out no, the Mexican team didn't want to do that? Were they singing "Everybody Wants to Rule the World" with Tears for Fears, but that didn't happen either? Did they get it completely wrong and sing along to Snooker Loopy, which was still in the nether regions of the chart? They accidentally turned over to watch John Virgo versus Cliff Thorburn. We'll never know. But yeah, a few kind of classics. It's worth noting also that the BBC and the ITV World Cup themes, Aztec Lightning and Aztec Gold, were also featuring in the charts, along with the Chicken song. So again, maybe Mexico chickened out when it really mattered. I'll get my coat.
Absolutely.
It's on.
Yes.
Is this on? You know?
Oh, at number 40, it was Sinful, Pete, and there you go. I think that's very apt for you there. Well, having listened to all of that, Pete, and cried into your pillow all afternoon to get over this defeat, you're off to the movies. It was all about Top Gun this summer, I think, wasn't it? Would that have got you over this disappointment now, if you were Mexican persuasion?
Yeah, I mean, it's American heroes, though, isn't it? I mean, I think the Karate Kid Part 2, that was probably up there as well, wasn't it? As one of those kind of classics of the summer. I was thinking about this. Probably the only two I reckon I would have watched at the time were Police Academy 3, Back in Training. Again, we could joke about with a Mexican team sent back into training. And Short Circuit. I definitely remember going to see that one, the kind of the police robot. I think that was it. So yeah, there are a couple of kind of classics that summer. But yeah, Top Gun was the one that certainly over here was the biggest one, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, instead of the movies then, if you'd probably seen Top Gun 10 times by this point anyway, what else was on TV this evening when we could have been enjoying Mexico's game? Well, earlier that day was the quarterfinal between Brazil and France.
What a game.
That was on the BBC. What a game indeed. A far, far better game than Mexico-West Germany, it has to be said.
Amazing game.
That followed an episode of Sorry and Dukes of Hazzard. So a fine early evening there leading into that game. But you could stay up late and get over to ITV for the late night Mexico-West Germany match, which was scheduled to end at 1. I think it probably went on a bit later than that into penalties. Fair play to anyone who stayed up. But if you wanted an evening of something else, you could have had Hill Street Blues over on Channel 4. You could have had Cagney and Lacey and the Bob Monkhouse Show on the BBC and Thunderbolt and Lightfoot on BBC Two. I'm sure they would all pique your interest far more than the Mexico-West Germany encounter that was probably sending everyone to sleep.
Yeah, you could probably watch most of them on, sort of channel 60 odd or 70 odd. They're probably still floating around the higher reaches of the TV Freeview channels as we speak. So why not search around the channels late at night and see if you can find Dukes of Hazzard and Hill Street Blues.
And then switch back on in time for the penalty shootout to see Mexico shoot themselves in the foot once again. And there we go. Ended on theme, very Mexico-y, this tale of Mexican misfortune and a little bit of success that we've gone through. Quite the epic, I think. Thank you very much, Pete, for all your knowledge. Lots of really interesting stuff to get through. So muchas gracias.
De nada, un placer. No, thanks very much, mate. Always good to go back in history and dig out the old stories and memories. So good fun.
Absolutely. And thank you, everyone, for listening as well. If you like what we do give us a share, a follow, a review, and all of that stuff. And do join us again next time at Your Boys Took a Hell of a Beating. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.